Let's give a warm welcome to Swarnava Banerjee, who is our next speaker. He is a co-founder, developer, and designer at Myth Atelier, which is an indie game company that's remote that specializes in turn-based games. So this should not surprise you that today he's here to talk about RPG, specifically how to make your fights awesome, how to make your combat awesome. So without further ado, let's show him some love in the chat.
Hello, everyone. This is Massive Damage, Creative Storytelling Through Numbers in RPG Combat Systems. My name is Swarnava Banerjee. I'm a game designer and producer at Myth Atelier LLC. We're a small independent studio who do both contract work and our own games. Here's a couple of them below. So this talk will cover the overarching goals of combat systems. We'll then funnel down into damage numbers. I'll provide a couple tools for how you can estimate them. And then we'll look at how we can use them to tell specific stories through our combat systems. So an important question to ask is, does your RPG even need a combat system? Now, if you're watching this talk, this is a little bit facetious, but it's to start us to get thinking critically about what we're trying to achieve with combat in our RPGs. Just because it's an RPG doesn't mean we have to put it in there. It has to achieve a particular thing. So a certain question to ask are stakes. What does the player gain or lose by engaging in this activity? I use example of Romancing Saga 3, where there's a specific character progression system that requires them to put characters into combat so that they can learn their character skills. What are we testing about the player? And does the player control when they're not in combat? I use example of Pokemon here because Pokemon very clearly delineates between its combat zones and non-combat zones. We know that if we are in if we are seen by a trainer, that'll trigger a trainer battle. We know that when we're in wild grass, after a number of steps, a random encounter will happen. And importantly to this talk is, how is a narrative reinforced by combat? Do the experiences of combat pay off in some way? And something to think about is, are you considering losing, right? Because most of the time when you lose, we just sort of game over and put the player at a restart point, but maybe the losing can be more interesting narratively. So in front of you, I have 6 different combat systems spanning nearly about 30 years of game development. And it's the same toolbox, but they're being used in very different ways. And the way that I would identify the difference being is in tone. So each of these games are looking to do a different thing within this combat tool set. Let's take the example of Final Fantasy 13, which is trying to create this cinematic heroic action feeling. You start in the hundreds of numbers, you go up to the thousands, right? You're building up the stagger gauge so that there's this big critical turn. And smaller things like status effects, right, are just icons on a bar, and most of them are not even permanent, right? So they only matter within the context of a fight. By contrast, we have a game like Darkest Dungeon, which is using much lower numbers. We have multiple sort of soft timers through bleed and poison, right? Misses and crits are massively swingy to the experience, right? And anytime a party engages in combat, they are left scarred and irreparably changed. And there's all of the other tones in between, which we can do through different tools. So let's take a look at the sources of numbers. I've roughly categorized them into 3 sources, and we can look at different combat system UI to see where they all land. So primary numbers are things like resources and damage. For example, even if you have a UI similar to that of Xenoblade's, right? Xenoblade is still pretty good about being like, oh, the most important number, yeah, that's the one you will see, right? Like almost immediately. Primary numbers allow the player to do moment-to-moment decisions, whereas secondary numbers, like attributes and modifiers, allow for more long-term strategic thinking. So, for example, players considering their build, they don't need that immediately in the combat situation, but maybe they ought to know that a debuff is reducing an attribute, which is reducing their ability to deal damage. Last but not least, we have tertiary numbers. I use the example of FF12 because it uses a number of arbitrary numbers as the fuel for multiple skills, right? Things like step count, game time. These are things that may or may not increase during a combat, but the player can check in between combat instances and see how it affects the gameplay system. So any talk about damage, we'll need to talk about damage formulas at some point. And I have 3 examples from 3 very popular series. Now, the damage formula is using those values that we established earlier and using them to calculate the damage output. And most of the time, they are composed of an attack term, a defense term, and then there might be some modifiers involved. Some damage formulas also incorporate randomness as a part of them. But the damage formula, and especially for those of you that are a little bit math averse, it only needs to be as complicated as the system that you want to model. So Dragon Quest, for its first 6 games, right, used a relatively simple, easy to understand formula, and they got a lot out of it. There's a lot of combat differentiation, right, that can come from a very basic formula. Notice that the evasion and critical rates are fixed values. Now, this might have been due to a technical limitation, right? But it's only very recently that they have pegged them to an attribute, and even so, like, it doesn't have that much of an impact. So things to be aware of in damage formulas is that, yeah, the complexity depends on you. If you don't understand your own damage formula, right, then that is a problem, right? So you'll want to make it simple enough that you can design within it. You'll want to make sure that the attack term largely rises faster than the defense ones. Now, this depends on your RPG and your gameplay systems, but if the defense term rises faster than the attack term, and you can curve this out, you can use Desmos or Wolfram Alpha, right, to model it, right? You don't want damage hitting 0. You don't want the combat state to stall out. You want it to always push forward. And last but not least, no matter how complex your damage formula is, and I use the example of Pokemon here because the number of modifiers that are applied are quite significant. If you give the player a heuristic, right, something like a weapon triangle or type advantage, that's something that they'll latch onto, and they'll see differences in damage and use that part as their decision making rather than care about the granularity of the formula. So how are these damage numbers presented? Well, here's a couple of reasons for why you may want to present them differently. You're trying to show the same number, right? But you're trying to show it in different instances. And here's a couple of ways that you can create some variation. So you can change the notation. A popular way is to add a exclamation mark in terms of critical damage. But here we see a couple examples of changes in color and scale, right? Changes in font, right? And a big one is pop-up animation. So pop-up animation, here's one from Secret of Mana, and it really sells how hard-hitting critical hits are, whereas base normal hits, right, don't have nearly as much font impact. Numerical gradation. So we'll use the term orders of magnitude, right? And we'll use it going forward as OOM. So the bigger the difference between 2 instances of damage in orders of magnitude, the more visible the change will be to the player. So if a player does an attack that results in 25 damage, and they do an attack that results in 1,324 damage, they're gonna pick the 1,324 one, right? But note that as the damage values keep increasing, players will really only have the time to process the first 2 digits of any damage value. So the difference between these two, right, may be more significant, but for most players, it'll be, yeah, it's roughly 1,000 apart, right? That was the difference between them. Now, within the same order of magnitude, you can do some interesting things where players will pick up on half, double, right, quadruple, right, multiples, right, from an expected damage baseline. And you can use this to communicate, for example, weaknesses, resistances, things like that. However, there's a diminishing return, right? So as the damage numbers keep increasing, players may not notice the change. So in the bottom, we have 2 values that are 40,000 apart. However, to the player, in that instance, a pop-up will read them effectively the same until they spreadsheet it out later. So if you're doing an MMO, this is probably okay. Right. So damage natures. So damage natures are putting together the way the numbers look, the way that they interact in mechanics, right, to create different feeling types of skills, different feeling types of attacks. I use the example of the Hades God boons here because it's a very good example of different damage natures. They take a single baseline damage, right? And depending on which of the God boons are taken, you can make them add damage over time. You can create spike damage, right? You can create different AoE effects, right? And they feel meaningfully different, right? Even though they're just modifying that baseline damage value. And so you can use this to create differences between characters, between weapons, between elements, right? And also in encounter design. So designing your enemies such that they respond to one damage nature better than others, right? Will mean that, oh, we should use different skills and different characters and vary up the gameplay. So here's a tool that I use that helps me sort of ballpark the rough, where the damage numbers need to be at for a fight. So I call this a stars align calculation. And what we're doing here is we're trying to establish for a given encounter what are the best and worst case scenarios, right, in terms of damage. This has a lot of steps, but they're generally pretty simple. So step one and step two, your info gathering, right? So what are the design goals of the encounter? Like what has been communicated to you by either the team lead, right, or the person in charge of narrative design, right? And then you want to grab the parameters that are relevant to the encounter for when the player runs into the encounter. And if you don't know, right, for example, if you allow the player to customize their build, make an educated guess, right? Then we calculate the party's lowest and highest damage, then the enemy's lowest and highest damage, and then sort of like Rock'em Sock'em Robots, right? We consider them as one entity dealing damage to each other each turn in order to estimate how long for each of these scenarios the combat encounter will last, right? If the best and worst case scenarios are outside of our goals, we will go back to step two, adjust our parameters, and run the simulation again. And we keep doing this until the best and worst cases are within an acceptable threshold of experience. And then we go in and we fine tune, right, on a per round basis or a turn basis, how the combat goes. So I'll take a case study from a boss fight that I helped design for Eternal Remnant. So the design goals that were given to me by the lead were that the Mauler is an early game boss of a sort of physical bruiser variety. This is the first boss the player fights with a full party. The party complement is 3, and it needs to take about 3 to 5 minutes of playtime. In the narrative, we have one character, the main character, who mistrusts a new party member, and this is the fight that forces them to have to work together so that they realize that they have a common goal. So with those design goals in mind, and when I went and extracted some values. So here I have the parameters for each of them at the expected level. And then I have some base parameters for like a physical bruiser boss, right, off this level. The number that is right next to the maximum health, there is an interrupt mechanic in the game. I just had to account for it. So we calculate the party's lowest and highest. We calculate the enemy's lowest and highest. And note, if you're calculating for an enemy troop, just do exactly the same as you would with the party. Take the attack for lowest damage, take the action that would do the lowest damage and apply any debuffs to it. And then for highest damage, take the action that would do the highest damage and apply any buffs to it. Now, this is recurring damage, right? So we are not taking into account special abilities, limit breaks, one-time instances, right? Or game-specific mechanics, right? We're just trying to get ballpark numbers. And what you will the result of this will be is 4 scenarios, right? 2 of them are worst-case scenarios. So this is where the party is not doing enough damage and the boss isn't doing enough damage. So the fight just logs, right? And then there's where the boss sweeps the party, right? So the party isn't keeping up with the damage race, right? And the boss is able to wipe them. Now, the sweep, it may be okay if you allow the player to run away, right? Then they should last a couple rounds, realize I cannot win this fight, right? And be able to run away. However, for a boss, where at least in this game, we don't allow escaping. So we had to essentially make sure that even if the sweep case happens, there's enough rounds that the full party can recover from it. And then there's 2 best case scenarios. The blitz case is where the party is doing fantastically. They're dealing out all the damage and the fight comes to an end. This might be okay for a boss like Mauler, but for a story boss, one that we have some buildup and gravitas, right? You never want the blitz case to go off, right? You want the fight to have an appropriate amount of difficulty and push back against the player. Finally, we have the volatile case. These fights are really fun, right? Both the player and the enemy are dealing a ton of damage to each other. However, this can also be very swingy. So if crits and misses happen during this case of the fight, right, it could really throw off your numbers. Now, most of your fights will actually be in the middle, right? And so these were essentially the bounds that were acceptable within the fight. Speaking honestly, I think 10 rounds is still too bad for the slog case. I think it should have been closer to 8 rounds. So I would have gone back, right, adjusted the parameters until I would be able to get it to like an 8 round, right, and then 3-3, 5. Okay, so that's the stars align calculation. So now, how does that translate into experiential differences? How does it translate into story? So critical hits and misses, right, most impact the pacing of the combat. So those round counts, right, if the player is doing critical hits, they will shorten the expected round count length. And if the enemy is doing them, they will actually extend it because the player is having to recover from the critical hit. Now that might be okay for a boss fight. However, if the player is going through regular encounters and enemies keep critting them, right, it's going to turn every regular encounter into a slog, right? And we want to avoid that as much as possible. Now, misses are more contentious, right? Because if the player does them, right, the combat extends, right? It doesn't move the combat state forward, and it also builds frustration for the player if there isn't a skill-based element, right, to your hit calculation. On the enemy side, you can use this for dramatic effect. So if a party member is on the ropes and an enemy goes to attack them and they miss, right, then the player's like, phew, big sigh of relief. This is something that the Megaten games do really well. So as the developer or the designer, you have complete control over the enemy side of the combat. So on the back end, you can use this tool to dictate pacing, right? And just make sure that encounters stay engaging and they don't outstay their welcome, right? If the player's missing a lot, right? Just turn down the evasion rate, right, on the enemy, right? If the player's close to wiping, right, then just make sure that the enemy really sells it. And this now translates into party dynamics, which is a huge element of narrative. So I use the example of Final Fantasy X here because it's early game. The way it did its enemy encounters allowed it to showcase different party members' strengths and weaknesses, right? And so by the time you get to mid-game, you have defined roles for the characters. Even if you're building the sphere gets differently, right? You know that, oh, for this type of enemy, bring Auron in. For this type of enemy, bring Lulu in, right? That helps sell why the characters need to rely on each other. If you have build synergies and build anti-synergies, right, you can use those to reinforce relationships. So let's say the player goes through 5 fights where these 2 characters are really vibing, right? They are buffing each other, they are supporting each other, right? It's a good relationship. If there's a narrative moment where they acknowledge this, it's been earned, right? Because the player has experienced this in mechanics and we can pay this off in narrative. Similarly, if 2 characters are fighting over the same resource or their fighting styles just don't mesh, right? And they have an argument, once again, it's been earned, right? Because the player has been experiencing this contention as well. Combo moves, right? I use the example of the baton pass from Persona 5, right? Turn let's work together into a player action verb, right? And if it is effective in combat, then anytime the narrative pushes towards party cohesion or togetherness, it will once again feel earned. Last but not least, combat is a frame of view. So if you can give it to enemy characters, right, it can do a really interesting thing where the player can sympathize a little bit with them. I use the example of Breath of Fire 4 here because it very effectively turned one of its antagonistic figures to have much more nuance, right, than if we had just, met them blindly, right, by cutting away to them, showing how they fight, right, and also it built up to the eventual encounter, right, because I knew just how strong they were. We'll briefly touch upon damage scaling. So this is a very clear way in an RPG to show progression, right, from early to mid to late game. And I have some sample damage scaling numbers from 3 popular RPG series. Now, this can have various impacts. So depending on the rate of scaling, if you have some nonlinear elements to your game, it may polarize early to late game content, right? Sometimes you may want this. You may want the player to come back into an early area and stomp through the enemies, and that's a good feeling. But if you do want them to experience the content, right, then this might end up trivializing it, and you may look into, hey, can we flatten the damage curve a little bit, right? The biggest thing that will need to change with damage scaling is enemy HP, right? Calculate the party's average damage per turn, right, to see how many hits an enemy survives for at any point in the game, right? And you can shake up expectations. So if a late game enemy you're doing early game damage to, that all of a sudden becomes a point of interest. Or if an early game enemy is doing late game damage to you, right, the players are going to remember that. So here's the big thing that this talk is about. Let's put it all together in a storytelling workshop. So here's a sitch, right? Your writer comes to you and they're like, I've written this great encounter, right? Can you implement it? So this is a mid-boss, sort of a mid-game boss encounter, right? We'll call the character Midnight, right? That is initially fought by one party member, Rogue, who is a sort of DPS character, in a duel-like fashion before the rest of the party arrives and it escalates into a full boss fight. Now, Rogue needs to be able to survive long enough for the party to make it. And once the party makes it, right, the boss needs to be able to survive the party's onslaught so that they can transform into the true boss, right? And then once that has happened, we actually want the party to be able to win, right, at this point. And the reason is maybe maybe the game has a restriction where you can't pick up on a fight midway through the fight. So we don't want the player to have to do this fight over again because we lose the dramatic tension instantly. So here's how I would go about implementing it using the tools I've outlined before. We can break down the fight into phases, right? And there's 3 distinct phases, right? We have a Rogue versus Midnight fight. We have a party versus Midnight fight for exactly 1 round, right? And then we have a party versus Mid-Damon fight, which is the boss that they transform into. So for the first part of the fight, we want it to feel like a duel, right? We should take the expected level of Rogue, right? Use those attributes in order to calculate how much damage they can put out. Now, we want Midnight to feel like a threatening figure, right? Rogue should be plinking off Midnight, right? They are not getting much purchase, and Midnight is carving chunks out of their HP, right? So in order to really sell, right, the fact that like Rogue is like on their last ropes, we want to put Rogue down to 10% or lower of their max health. Now the player can use items to like keep Rogue up, right? But if we are sort of showing Midnight carving chunks off, right, then the player will feel like, oh, I have entered into this fight and it's already lost. Now in Midnight's side, you want to make sure none of Midnight's attacks critical, right? You want to make sure that they're doing set amounts of damage, they're doing it for chunks of HP, but they are keeping in track that we want to keep Rogue alive, right? Long enough for the party to be able to enter. This is a designer call. You may allow Rogue to die if there's an early reset point. However, I feel that we want to do this in sort of one go, right? So watch Rogue's health. You can deal percentile damage rather than absolute damage as a way to keep this in check. Now, the second phase is once the party arrives, right? Now, things from the calculation turn from keeping Rogue alive to keeping Midnight alive. You need to make sure that Midnight survives one round of the party's highest damage per turn, right? And you need to start calculating this from the best case scenario of the previous phase. So if Rogue was dealing maximum damage, right, the previous time, the party is just going to pick up where they left off and do an absolute smackdown on Midnight. Now you can prepare for this, right? Midnight can cast a buff on themselves before the party arrives, or they can heal from their attacks on Rogue, right? Which will really sell the hopelessness, right, of a fight. But plan to have enough health such that if every single party member criticals, right, on their highest damage attack, that Midnight survives. Worst case scenario, put an immortal tag, right, on Midnight, right? Talk to your developer, see if you can get that there, just in case your math is slightly off. And if you're feeling ballsy enough, you may actually just allow the player to win at this point. But talk to your writer before you do this so that there's a narrative contingency in place. The final phase, right? We don't have to worry about Midnight's HP anymore, right? Midnight is transforming into a new entity, right? However, you don't want to give the new entity a full health bar. We want to show that some progress was made, right? That midnight and middaymon, right, are sort of one entity. So you may want to carry over some of the damage, right, or at least a portion of the start middaymon out slightly damaged. In order to make sure that the party just doesn't lay into middaymon, have middaymon summon some enemies to back them up as well. Most of the time, the players will just focus on the biggest target. But if those enemies are doing crowd controlling abilities, or they're healing middaymon, right, from the damage you did to them, then you'll be able to funnel the damage into the enemies first before the player goes after middaymon, right? Change the damage nature, right? So far the player has been plinking off midnight, right? What you want to do instead, right, is have the damage nature increase so that there's a feeling of momentum, right, in this part of the fight. And then for middaymon, none of their skills should be party wipes, right? They should be able to maybe take out a single party member or put a single party member into critical health, right? But now the party has 3 actions, right? Again, depends on your game system, but it has 3 actions to deal with one party member being down. So they are much more able to recover, right, from any death spirals, right? This will allow the party to eventually triumph, right? And, friendship wins again. Now, if you really want to sell the narrative of this fight, now have middaymon be weak to something only rogue can do, right? Maybe it's poison damage, right? Maybe they are just really badly react to criticals, right? And this makes it much more likely that rogue delivers a finishing blow. And now we have a full arc playing out over the course of a fight. We have rogue setting out on their own, right? Feeling like they're on death's door. The party comes and reinforces them, right? But it's not enough, right? Midnight transforms into middaymon, right? And ultimately, rogue is able to pull through because of the help the party provided, right? So they are able to accomplish the goal that they set out with, right? But only because the party was there to help them, right? And if you can tell stories like that using the tools that are provided and any others that you pick up along the way, you're well on your way to doing some great combat design in this space. So yeah, that's all I have in terms of time. Here's every game that was referenced, right? They're all really good, so go check them out. If one of your favorite games is not on here, I'm very sorry. I try to include as many as possible. And if you're curious about other games that take this kind of approach or take interesting approach to damage numbers, right? Please check these games out. They're all indie games. A lot of them are free, right? And they are only a couple hours long, but they're doing very interesting things in this RPG space. Lastly, here are my socials. So you can find me at my website, or more likely on Twitter, right? You can check out our company page on itch, right? And also many thanks to my coworker, Isaiah, who helped out a lot with this presentation. Okay, that's all I have for now.
Thank you so much, Swarnava, for that riveting talk on damage numbers and combat. A slight departure from combat. Did y'all know that Game Devs of Color has its own job board? If you haven't, I would encourage you to take a look. Some of our premium sponsors like Microsoft, aka Xbox, will be listing potential opportunities on there. So if you haven't already, take a peek.